Hey everybody, welcome to another week of Epic Online. We are going to do another lesson today on this subject of fear. We've been looking now this is our third week. The first couple weeks we looked at fear, and the first week we said that we need to make sure that we focus on God's love instead of how we feel and how we fear. And if we can do that, we can trust Him even in the times that we're afraid. Last week we looked at this idea that you need to stop making excuses because of fear and think that you can't do something, because even if you can't, He can. And so we looked at that last week. And we will continue now this week to be looking at this idea of fear. And we're going to look at another element of fear that I think a lot of us are feeling right now. Fear has a way of making us feel isolated and alone. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to talk about it in the sense of how fear tries to really put a sting on us. Now, if you know what a sting operation is, it's basically where the police will plant something or make something look good in order to catch criminals. This happens all the time, and fear will do the same type of thing, and I'll explain that in a moment. But one of these sting operations I thought was hilarious, and I found it on YouTube, and I'm going to go ahead and show you guys this video as we think about the idea of fear putting a sting operation on us. Fooling us is really what we're looking at. Just like we looked at being hustled last week, this week we're going to look at what it looks like to be fooled by fear into believing something that isn't true, and it always gets us in trouble. So with that, why don't you take a look at this video as we start our time together. Take a look.
Just follow him back there. Party's back there. Yeah.
After registering in the lobby, this guy thought he was going into another room for a free DVD player.
Hey, man, congratulations.
But Chandler police had a different prize for him.
Just follow him back there. Party's back there. Yeah.
After registering in the lobby, this guy thought he was going into another room for a free DVD player.
Hey, man, congratulations.
But Chandler police had a different prize for him and 24 others who have outstanding arrest warrants, mostly for DUIs.
Our warrant officer realized there was a huge amount of outstanding DUI warrants. He sent all of the suspects letters to their last known address, informing them that they had been, selected to receive a prize, and gave them a time and location where they needed to show up.
The cameras out front actually added to the atmosphere by drawing the suspects into the, illusion that they were getting a prize.
Eddie Burns set up the cameras for the Chandler Police Department, one in front, one in back, and a hidden camera, so officers knew when suspects were coming. When they first showed up in the lobby of the Chandler Center for the Arts, those with warrants registered at this table, and all these workers here are actually police officers.
They had their identity confirmed. They were escorted to the back by undercover officers, and they were taken into arrest.
Come on. You have a warrant for your arrest. You've been caught up in the police sting.
What?
You have a warrant for your arrest, ma'am. You're under arrest.
Are you kidding me?
No, you're under arrest.
You're not going first. Thank you. This is a joke.
No, it's not a joke. You are under arrest.
What
You have a
for?
warrant for your arrest.
The officer or detective.
I don't understand. Why?
Did you have a ticket that you haven't taken care of? Well, they were pretty long.
Yeah, I think
Hey,
so,
let's
but I
explain it to
don't
you.
think it went
We're
this...
gonna
People were upset, others disappointed, but all seemed surprised. After they were cuffed, the suspects were loaded into a van and taken to jail.
After police officers closed up shop and locked the door, 2 more people showed up, banging on the door, insisting they be allowed to claim their prize.
And they were arrested too.
If anybody has warrants, take care of them.
Because you never know when the prize patrol is coming.
Thank you.
Well, those guys weren't very bright. They got fooled by the police and ended up being arrested when they thought they were coming to collect a DVD player. And that seems so crazy to us. And yet so many times we end up feeling, we end up getting fooled in much the same way. We end up believing the lies that fear tells us, and that puts us in a place where we think something wrong. And when we inaccurately look at something, then it can change the way we look at things, change the way we feel, change the way that we operate. And we're going to look at a Bible story today in just a moment. We're going to look at Elijah. Now, Elijah is a prophet that we see in Scripture that came around during the nation of Israel. Israel and Judah had been split. We'll look at this as we continue on in our Gospel Project study next year. But Elijah is a prophet of God, and basically the job of a prophet is to tell the people and to show the people who God is and bring them to a place where they will follow him again. And Elijah was one of the most famous prophets. And we're going to talk about him today, and we're going to look at this idea that fear actually put a sting operation on him, that convinced him of something that wasn't true, that made him run in fear, and not, for a little while, not fulfill the calling that God had placed on his life. And we're going to look at this, and it's going to be in 1 Kings chapter 19. And we're going to look at Elijah's feelings and how fear overtakes him and how he believes a lie. And we'll look at that, and that lie that he believes is that he is alone. And we're going to look at that as we look at this passage. But a little bit of context. As I said, Elijah is a prophet. And one of the main stories that maybe you already know about Elijah is his showdown with the prophets of Baal. Instead of telling you all about the story and going back and reading it again, Elijah had this mountaintop experience where he saw God give great victory right before we get to the place where we're going to be reading here in 1 Kings chapter 19. But with all that being said, I'm going to show you a video here. Again, another kids video, but I think it's something that will remind us what happened between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. This is right before what we're going to read today, and that's important that we understand the context. So with that being said, take a look at this video as we watch to see what happened to Elijah and the prophets of Baal.
Ahab was the king of Israel. He was an evil king. He led the Israelites away from God, and the Israelites worshipped a false god named Baal. The things King Ahab did made God angry, so God caused a drought. The drought would show King Ahab and all the people that God, not Baal, is powerful and in control of all things. A drought made life very hard. For 3 years, no rain fell on the land. The lakes and rivers dried up. People could not grow crops in the fields. Finally, God was ready to send rain. God sent a prophet named Elijah to give a message to King Ahab. You have caused this trouble by disobeying God and worshiping false gods, Elijah told him. No. Then Elijah invited King Ahab, the Israelites, and the prophets who worshipped Baal to gather at Mount Carmel. Elijah told the people, "Make up your minds. If you believe the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him." Elijah set up a challenge to show who the one true God is. The prophets of Baal set up an altar for their false god. They prepared a bull and put it on their altar. You call to Baal and ask him to send fire to your altar, Elijah told the people. I will call on the Lord. The God who answers by fire is the one true God. From morning until noon, the prophets of Baal cried out to Baal. Answer us, they said, but no one answered. The prophets danced and cried and cut their bodies. Still, no one answered. Then the people gathered around Elijah. He dug a trench around his altar, prepared a bull, and put it on a pile of wood. Elijah had 4 jars of water poured on the wood. Then he asked for more water. Everything was wet. The water ran down the altar and filled the trench. Elijah prayed to God, Lord, answer me so that these people will know that you, Lord, are God. God sent fire from the sky. The fire burned up the bull, the wood, the stones, and the dust. It burned up the water in the trench. There was no doubt that the Lord is the one true God. The men who had worshipped Baal fell on their faces and said, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" Then Elijah killed all the prophets who worshipped Baal. The sky grew dark with clouds, and God sent a great rain. The Lord ended the drought and proved that He is the one true God.
So that's what happened as Elijah faced off with the prophets of Baal. We see that God proved himself to be the God who he says he is. Elijah was the one who called down the fire from heaven that God sent to show that the prophets of Baal were not real prophets of a real God. And Elijah had this incredible experience, so much so that the opposition of God was actually destroyed for a short time. And we see that happening in Elijah's life, and you would think that he'd be on top of the world. We would think that he'd have everything that he'd ever wanted, that he would be able to be going around with all the confidence that he would ever need. And yet now when we look to 1 Kings chapter 19, and this is what we see happen in the next stage following what happened to Elijah on the mountain of Carmel. And we're going to see what happens here. And by the way, if you've been watching looking for the code word for today, the code word for today's lesson is going to be the name of the queen, the name of the female character that we read about here in this passage and that was already talked about earlier on. And so let's just read in chapter 19. Ahab told Jezebel everything that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, "May the gods punish me and do to me severely, if I don't make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Then Elijah became afraid and immediately ran for his life. He came to Beersheba, and that belonged to Judah, and he left his servant there. But he went on a day's journey into the wilderness. He sat down under a broom tree and prayed that he might die. He said, "I have had enough. Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers." Then he lay down and slept under the broom tree. Suddenly an angel touched him. The angel told him, "Get up and eat." Then he looked, and there at his head was a loaf of bread baked over hot stones and a jug of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. Then the angel of the Lord returned for a second time and touched him and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey will be too much for you." So he got up, ate and drank, and on the strength from that food he walked 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God, and he entered a cave there and spent the night. Suddenly the word of the Lord came to him and said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God of armies, but the Israelites have abandoned your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are looking for me to take my life." Then he said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the Lord's presence." At that moment the Lord passed by. A great and mighty wind was tearing at the mountains and shattering cliffs before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake there was a fire, and the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire there was a voice, a soft whisper. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Suddenly a voice came to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" "I have been very zealous for the Lord God of armies," he replied, "but the Israelites have abandoned your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are looking for me to take my life." Then the Lord said to him, "Go and return by the way you came, by the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you are to anoint Hazael, the king over Aram. You are to anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel, and Elisha, son of Shaphat, from Abel-Manoah, as a prophet in your place. Then Jehu will put to death whoever escapes the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death whoever escapes the sword of Jehu. But I will leave 7,000 in Israel, every knee that has not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." All right, we are told in this passage what happens directly after this great experience that Elijah has. He sees great victory that God has as he burns up the offering and as the prophets of Baal are destroyed. But then we see Jezebel, this evil queen who doesn't have any love for God. In fact, she's an idol-worshiping woman. And she is upset. She's angry. And so what she basically says to Elijah is, "Hey, you're about to die too." So basically she tells him, "You're going to die and I'm coming after you." And all of a sudden Elijah, who just had this incredible moment with God, incredible moment of seeing God's power, what does the Bible tell us? He ran away afraid. Elijah, a man of God, a prophet of God, who had just seen such miraculous things, who had just experienced victory, is running away. And we see that he runs away, he goes through the wilderness, he ends up in a cave. And as he ends up in a cave, he is looking for a way just to get away from it all. Actually, what he says here in this passage is he wishes he would die. That's how afraid he is. So, guys, this is how he feels. Like, we're not hiding anything here. People, even prophets of God, have felt fear to the point where he just doesn't even want to be on the earth anymore. He wants God to take him because he's so afraid. And so he comes and he hides in a cave. We see that God provides for him, provides bread and provides drink for him from the angel of the Lord that is sent to him. And by now you'd think Elijah would definitely be away from his fear and be all better and move on with his life. But instead he continues on and he hides himself all the way out in the mountains in a deep cave where nobody can find him. He's still hiding. He's still scared. And God comes to him. God comes to him and wants to have this conversation with him. And he says, Elijah, wait for my presence and then come out and speak to me. And we see this great wind that comes through and this great earthquake and a fire that all of us would think, well, these are really big, huge things. This must be God's presence. But instead, God's presence is seen in a small whisper. Now I'm going to talk about what that might mean in just a moment. But as Elijah goes out then and starts speaking to God and talking about it, and God is asking him, why are you here? 2 times he asks Elijah, why are you here? And Elijah says, I have been zealous, I have done your work, and yet people are dying, and your prophets are dying, and I have lost all hope. And then he goes on and says, I am alone. He says that twice. He says, I alone am left, and they are looking for me to take my life as well. Elijah had bought into a lie. He had been tricked by fear. Fear had made him think something that wasn't really true, because now he feels like he is alone and he has no hope. A couple things that we can see as we look at this passage, though, is first of all, God's presence is here. It doesn't take a big moment for God's presence to be around. A lot of us think that in order to feel God's presence or to know that he's with us, we need to have like a camp experience or have a really big worship experience where we feel him. But that's not what we see here. God's presence is found in a soft whisper as Elijah talks to God here. God says, I am with you, and my presence is with you all the time, even in the times that are crazy and big, like what Elijah just experienced on the mountain. God was there too, but God is also in the cave, in the small voice. That God will come to us even in the times where things aren't exciting or crazy or big, but at normal, mundane, small, quiet times in our life, God is there. And so the first thing we can understand is Elijah was buying the lie that somehow he was alone and had no hope. But God says, I am still with you. God says, I am right here talking with you. So God reminds Elijah that he is with him, which is the presence of God that we need to understand when we feel fear. Don't let fear convince us that we're all alone. Right now in this quarantine, then we can feel that way very easily. But first of all, we're not alone because God is always with us. The Bible is full of Bible verses that talk about how God is always with us. Jesus says before he left the earth, he says, I am always with you to the end of the age. God tells us over and over again that he is always right beside us. And you might forget that, and you might believe when fear says you're all alone. And that just allows us to get depressed, as Elijah was, ready to just be done with life, to walk away and just to give up. But that's not what we're called to do. And God says, I'm here to meet with you. Just come to me. And that's what Elijah did, and he comes later. The other part of this passage, at the end of it, what does God tell Elijah? He says, listen, I will leave 7,000 in Israel, every knee that has not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. Another thing that God reminds Elijah of is, Elijah, you may feel like you're alone. Your fear may be telling you that you're alone and you're the last one that's standing for me, but it's not true. God says, look, Elijah, there are 7,000 other people that are still following me. Go out from this mountain. Move on and do what I've called you to do. He tells him to go on and to anoint kings. That's one thing that the prophets did. And so he says, go do what I've asked you to do, because there are still people that are following me. I am still with you. No matter how you feel, no matter how afraid you are, no matter how alone you might think you feel, right now. All of that stuff doesn't matter. All that matters is that I am with you and that there are other people that I have preserved, that they will be with you as well. And how does that apply to us? Well, a couple of things. First of all, as I already said, God is always with us. But the second thing to understand is that even though we might be quarantined, and even though the only way we can interact right now is through a screen, I know that's not great, it's not ideal, and it can feel really lonely. But we're still here for one another. We're still around. We'll be able to be together again. And we are all in this fight together. We are all fighting this together. We are all trying to figure out how to not feel alone and how to fight fear. I'm with you. My family's with you. Your fellow teens in Epic, even though you might not be able to see them, we're all going through the same thing together. And we are fighting to keep God at the center of our life, fighting to keep remembering that He is with us, fighting to remember that we don't need to fear because He loves us, fighting to remember that we don't need to fear and make excuses to do what God has called us to do because He is with us. And now again, we don't have to feel lonely because He is with us and we are with one another. And so these are some things that I hope encourage you today as you think about the importance of not only remembering God's presence when you're afraid, but remembering that other people are with you. Other people are experiencing the same thing, and someday we will be together again. But in the meantime, I would encourage you, even this week, maybe reach out to somebody else in the youth group. Somebody you haven't talked to in a while, reach out with a text, reach out with a letter, chat with them on social media, find a way to connect with somebody, give them a call. Whether it may be a youth leader, or maybe it's another one of the teens. I would encourage you to reach out to one another and remind one another that we are not alone. Because there are people that are feeling lonely, even if you aren't. And I would encourage you to look for a way to show people that you are with them. So these are just a couple things that we might be able to do, to remember God's presence when we're afraid, and also to remember others. And if we can do those two things, I believe that we can move from a place of saying, I'm lonely, to saying, I'm not alone. You know, fear wants us to say, you're all alone. Fear wants us to say, I'm lonely. But God wants us to say, I'm not alone. And that's what we can remember today as we think about Elijah. We think about all that happened to him. No matter how much Jezebel wanted to kill him, God was stronger than Jezebel. And therefore God said, you go forward and do what I've called you to do. Don't live in fear anymore because I am here with you, and so are other people who love me. So those are things that we can remember during this time. One last illustration before I close. This illustration, I didn't realize this, but this is just a beautiful picture of what we're really talking about. And this comes from the story of a tribe of Native Americans. I don't know which tribe it is, but one of these tribes had a unique practice for training young braves. When it was time for the boy to become a man on his 13th birthday, he was placed in a dense forest to spend the entire night all alone. Until then, he had never been away from the security of his family and his tribe, but on this night, he would be blindfolded, taken miles away. When he would be blindfolded in the middle of these woods, and all night long, he would hear noises, he would hear everything happening, and all of a sudden, he would feel all alone, all night long, left with a blindfold. In the morning, when it was time to be done, no matter what sounds he heard, no matter what happened, in the morning, he would take off that blindfold to see if he had survived the night. But the cool part about this story is when he took off the blindfold, the young brave would see someone else standing there. His father had been standing there the whole night with a bow and arrow, ready to defend and protect his son, even though his son had no idea that his father was still in the woods. You say this is kind of a weird illustration, but it's really not to think about it. We might think we're alone in the middle of the woods. We might think we're alone in this quarantine. We might think we're alone, but there is one standing with us even when we can't see him or know he's there, and that is God, because we do know he's there because he's told us he is there. And not only that, but there are others standing in a circle around us even though we might not be able to see them. So don't buy the lies of the blindfold that you are alone and have no hope. God is with you. So are we. Have hope in the time of fear. All right, hope to see you guys in the Zoom. Please join us for that Zoom. We'll have a good conversation about this lesson and also how your life is going. Good to have this time with you guys again, and we'll see you later. All right, see ya.